everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So yesterday we started talking about the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and some of the initial ideas they came up with to replace the Articles of Confederation. Vast majority of them awesome. Pretty much most of the stuff that we talk about here at the Constitution, pretty impressive because they came up with it off the top of their head from Enlightenment thinkers. Today we're going to start talking about more of the details and the controversies, the different opinions, and how these compromises came through in the Constitution that we still have today. Kind of the thought process and the groupthink that went along with our founding fathers in this room to come up with a document that we still use today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So one of the biggest evils, you can just say evils, in American history is slavery. 100%. And it's interesting that slavery isn't really talked about in the Constitution. The same men who wrote all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. So there's some hypocrisy there, quite a bit, with slavery. So slavery, which 80 years from this point in history, 80 years from the creation of the Constitution, we're going to have a civil war in which 600,000 to 700,000 Americans will die because of the controversies that surrounded the institution of slavery. So the fact that slavery in the Constitution is hardly talked about seems crazy. Now, there is one particular situation in which slavery is talked about called the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is what we're getting ready to talk about right here with the Three-Fifths Compromise. It is worth noting here because I, as a history teacher and teach it all, it's hard to teach a little bit like one specific concept of slavery and ignore, because I always want to go down the rabbit hole of slavery talking about because it's wild and it's insane of humans owning other humans. Like, how did we ever let that happen? So, precursor here, and we're going to talk about this in detail when we get to the end of this course in our Challenges to American Ideals unit, specifically about slavery and that. So I'll touch on it right here because I don't want to, this is kind of the introduction here to it, and you may not have learned a lot about slavery. The reason that slavery doesn't really get talked about in the Compromise of 1787 is most people realized it was uncool at the time. Even though everybody was slave owners, there's a lot of people making money off of slave. The idea that you're bringing slaves from Africa over to the New World, forcing them to be slaves, seems really uncool. We had an extreme version of slavery in America called chattel slavery, where not only are the slaves owned, but their lineage after them is owned as well. It was happening in Brazil and other places. The only way you keep a population of slaves is to constantly bring in more slaves. Well, it had kind of gotten unpopular around the world. Obviously, because you're owning other humans for their entire existence and their children's existence and grandchildren. You get it. Slavery's evil, especially the extreme version we had in America. Everybody realized they're getting ready to get rid of that whole bringing in the slave trade situation. Anyway, the full-on belief was that once you end the slave trade, and we did, we actually ended the slave trade in 1808, which is about 20 years after this. 20 years isn't that short, but the federal government on its own says we're not bringing in any more slaves from Africa. That's messed up. We're done. Everybody knew that was going to happen anyway. So the idea was once you stop bringing in slaves, slavery will naturally go away on its own. All right. It's a whole story we'll talk about in another unit on why that didn't happen. That kind of caught everybody off guard. But this is why slavery isn't really talked about in the Constitution, is because it's kind of a touchy subject because everybody knows that you're owning another human and how can you do that? But they don't talk about it because it shouldn't actually go away on its own. However, there is the current issue that there are slaves. This is going to bring up what is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. All right? And the Three-Fifths Compromise is a little bit distorted in history because it deals with slavery. So I'm going to try to give it to you as straight as possible right here and explain to you how it's kind of misinterpreted a little bit in history by modern views on this. All right. So once we have established with the Great Compromise and the House of Representatives and the Senate that some of the power of representation that you have as a state is based on your population. The bigger the population, the more representatives you have, therefore the more power you have in the federal government, which is what everybody wants. Everybody wants more power. So it was basically like the guy sitting around like, all right, New York, how many people do you have in your state? And they're like, we have 300,000. Oh, God, that's a lot of time. Okay, and Pennsylvania, how many have? And they're like, we have 200,000. Like, oh, okay, that's awesome. And they're like, all right, Georgia, how many do you have? And they're expecting Georgia to be like 7. Georgia's like, we have 250,000. Like, 200. Georgia, you ain't got 250,000 people. Like, yes, we do. Yes, we do. And they're like, there's no way you have that many people. I'm making these numbers up. There's like, no way you have that many people. And they're like, And some dude from the north in the back said, wait a minute, George, are you counting your slaves in your population? And Georgia's like, yep, they're people. And they're like, yeah, but you own them. They're not citizens. They're like, I'm counting them in my population. So very quickly, when the population gives you power, the South wants to count their slaves in their population, whereas the North doesn't want to count it in population because then it would therefore decrease their power, and the way it's designed, it would then therefore give the North more power. So I tried to explain this. I tried to first off using this chart here. There's a lot of numbers here. You're like, well, these are census stuff. So I'm going to simplify it even further here. Now, usually I don't go out and make my own charts, but for you guys, you're worth it. I made my own chart here so I could very clearly explain to you what is happening. All right. So in 1787, if you count all the North's population and all the non-slave population in the South, the North has a much bigger population because the North here is the lighter blue of the two bar graphs. All right. So this would give the North more power. Well, the South, they desperately want as much power as possible. So the South says, no. We're counting our slaves in population. However, if the South is allowed to count all their slaves in their population, the South then has more power than the North. And the North is like, we absolutely cannot do that. So they start squabbling over what to do. Do you count all the slaves or none of the slaves? Because whichever way you go with that, it gives the other one more power. So as that argument goes on, the North realizes, wait a minute, aren't those slaves property? And the South is like, yeah. And they're like, aren't you supposed to be able to pay like property tax on that? And they're like, quite, because slaves are incredibly expensive. So if you had to pay taxes on your slaves, it would be an incredible amount of income. So the South's like, shut up, we don't want to pay taxes. And the North's like, no, let's talk about taxes now. So then the North brings in the idea that the South should have to pay taxes to the federal government based on their property, which is a human being. So what they end up deciding, and they end up saying, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to count 3 out of every 5 slaves for population. The reason is that random number, all right? And it's a relatively obscure, like why not 7/8? Why not, 1/2? Why not all? The reason is if you only count 3/5 of the slave population in the Southern total population, it pretty much is going to even out the populations of the North and the South. So therefore, neither side is stronger than the other. All right. They also, for the North, to counting any slaves made the North mad. They also told the North, and they're also going to pay taxes on 3 out of every 5 slaves as well in the South. So the 3/5 compromise is really about evening out the populations of the North and the South. So the southern states, again, want to count them all. Northern states don't want to count any of them, want to pay taxes. So the 3/5 compromise, as far as population goes, is designed to count slaves, 3 out of every 5 slaves in population. So the idea, and I see this really commonly, and it actually does an injustice to what people are trying to say. Today, looking back on this, people feel like the 3/5 compromise. I see this commonly, even though I'm looking up pictures of the 3/5 compromise, that a slave was considered 3/5 of a man. That they're not fully considered, equal with everybody else. I don't. That's not what this meant, because it's actually worse than that. They're just counting a random number and doing math on the amount of number, because slaves weren't counted as 3/5 of a person. They weren't counted as a person at all. They were owned, but they were property, like farm equipment. It's just so baffling to imagine that this happened in our society, or any society, for any human, ever. So to say, people get upset and looking at this and they're like, oh, they're counting slaves as each slave counted as 3/5 of a person, and like that, as trying to symbolize how inhumane slaves are treated. It wasn't even that good. It wasn't even 3/5. They weren't treated as equal. This is purely for politics. Slaves never got 3/5 of the benefits of a citizen. They didn't get any benefits of a citizen. They weren't. They were slaves. So the 3/5 compromise evens out slavery evens out the population for representation and taxation. So the question here is, what was the purpose of the 3/5 compromise? Why did both sides agree on the ratio of 3/5? The last part is like, why 3/5? Why not some other random ratio? And there was a specific reason they chose 3/5, and not just because they really like difficult fractions and math. So answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. Other things created by the Constitution: federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, Congress, and the Electoral College. Let me walk you through what each one of these means. Let's start with federalism. So federalism, fancy word, is not real complicated. It just means that power has to be shared between the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments. So there's no one end-all, be-all monarch, dictator, like here's what's going to happen. There's no one government that trumps all the other governments. All right. So the federal government exists and it has specific powers, but there's also powers that the state governments have. All right. And the federalism means the state governments and the federal government and the state government have to work together. And a lot of them have very clear responsibilities. All right. So the national government has federal power, like coining money, like states can't have their individual money. The state has their individual powers, like states generally are responsible for the education of the people in their own state. And then there's some concurrent powers where they kind of share and they're supposed to work together. All right. So federalism is the idea that the state governments and the federal governments work together, and not one of them gets the final say-so over the other. There are quite a few instances when this can lead to some pretty strong inconsistencies. So I'm going to point out 3 here to you, but you can find them all the time. Slavery, we've already been talking about that one. This is literally going to lead to the Civil War. I mean, the arguments over slavery, over who gets to make the final decision on that. Do the state governments get to make the decision on slavery? Or does the federal government, can they come in and make a sweeping rule for all the states on what they can do with slavery? That debate over slavery will lead to the Civil War and is an intricate part of U.S. history for the first half of U.S. history. More modern issues, marijuana legalization. So this is as of June 22nd, 2021. These are the areas in which marijuana is legal or not illegal. And you can see, as of June 22nd, 2021, only 3 states are illegal in all forms. All right? And you're like, well, okay, well, fantastic. All right. Whichever side you're on, I guess fantastic. I don't know. Oh, cool. Everybody seems to be agreeing on this. Here's the issue. These are what the states are saying. The federal government says marijuana is illegal. But the states, say California here, legal in all forms. Medical, recreational, is treated like alcohol. All right, it's regulated, but it is legal the same way alcohol is legal. right? You don't have to have a medical, you can go buy marijuana from California as of when this is June 22nd, 2021. However, the issue is the federal government says it's illegal. There was, when California was one of the first ones to start doing this, legalized it. While it was legal in California, the federal government would send marshals, which is like the police for the federal government, to go and raid a lot of these shops and shut them down because they're breaking federal law. But the state says it's legal, but the federal government says it's not, and there is a huge question over who gets the final say-so here in a state that has legalized marijuana if the federal government says it should be illegal. So federalism, the present day, causes an issue. The pandemic with COVID-19, where does the federal government, can they mandate vaccines? Can they mandate masks? Do you leave it to the states? Where does it go? And you saw very clearly where the lines were and how quickly they shifted back and forth over the give and take between who gets the final say-so on something, the state government or the federal government. So because if the federal government went in and told a state to do something, the state could be like, I'm not doing it, and push back. And the Constitution is designed where they have to work together, and it doesn't clearly say who gets to be the winner when there's a dispute. So federalism still causes inconsistencies today, but that amount of freedom really helps make sure issues don't get ignored altogether. The next thing that gets created here is the separation of powers, right? You got your legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch. We're going to talk about all these in detail in this course. The legislative branch is Congress. That's going to make your laws. The executive branch is what the president will be. The president enforces the laws. And then the judicial branch interprets laws and makes sure that the laws that get made coincide with the ideals in the Constitution. Checks and balances also get made. This is, as we have Montesquieu's idea, he had three branches of government, checks and balances. So they all basically share the same amount of power in the federal government. If one of them starts trying to abuse their power and take over more power, it's like a piece of a pie or a pizza. Like you're taking over more of the other people's power, and because they're basically designed to keep each other in check, it keeps our government from becoming corrupt, because if a corrupt person tries to take more power, they would be taking power from other politicians who probably don't like that, and they can team up and fight against them. And the checks and balances, where they basically keep each other in check, has worked very effectively. We also created Congress. The legislative branch and Congress is the same thing. The Senate, the House of Representatives, the two houses, I don't know why I put quotes on that. The two houses, the Senate and House of Representatives combined, is called Congress. So if you're a congressman, you could be in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. If you're a representative, you'd be in the House of Representatives. If you're a senator, you'd be in the Senate. But if you're a congressman, you could be in either one. It's kind of an obscure term. The other thing, and this is interesting. This is kind of a throwback to that fear of the Greek mob rule. They add in the Electoral College. This one's weird. This is just for the President of the United States. He's the only elected official that has this whole different process of getting elected. It's weird. So this is from a few years ago. The numbers here inside the state, so this is present day, are the amount of representatives from each state. So the bigger the number, the bigger the population is in a state, because the amount of representatives that you get is based on your population. So this is also the number of electoral college votes a state gets. So it's weird. Every other election, when somebody's running for an office, everybody goes and votes. Whoever gets the most votes wins. That's called the popular vote. That is not how the president is elected, and it's kind of weird. A lot of times, most of the time, whichever president gets the most votes wins, but that's not really always the case. So when you run for president, yes, you want people to vote for you, obviously. You're trying to see how many states that you can win. Because in North Carolina here, all right, if candidate A runs against candidate B, and candidate A gets 55% of the vote, and candidate B gets 45% of the vote inside the state of North Carolina, the only vote that matters is those 14 votes. Those are the only votes that count, and the Electoral College will cast those votes. But here's how it works. Whoever got the most votes in North Carolina gets all 14 votes. So they don't divide them up. So basically, if you win by this much in North Carolina, you get all of North Carolina's votes. So in the Electoral College, it really comes down as a president, you have to win more states than really getting more individual votes. And it's a really weird setup like that. And the reason that exists is because they didn't really trust the American people. The president was a very important position. They knew it when they made the Constitution. In theory, if everybody in America voted for some like complete moron, and everybody knew it was awful, the Electoral College could just vote for somebody else and pick another president instead of what the people wanted. It's like a check and balance on the American people. That has never happened. And now legally the Electoral College is not allowed to go against the people, but the Electoral College still matters. And it's still what casts the deciding vote for the president. So the electoral vote, so the president, like while millions and millions and millions of people could vote for a presidential candidate, it really comes down to how many electoral votes can they get. And there's like 535 possible votes that they can get. So as soon as they hit 272, 273, based on these numbers, how many states that they won, they can't be beat. So the Electoral College is kind of a check and balance on the American people. But the question here is, how could the interpretation of federalism possibly cause issues in America? And we had talked about a few there. So pause me, answer this completely, and we'll move on. All right. So they had this fantastic Constitution. Like, yay, fantastic Constitution. Everything's wonderful. Hooray. It doesn't mean anything. It was just a group of smart guys that sat inside a room and wrote stuff down. They now actually have to get it passed. So what they actually have to do is they have to go around and convince the rest of the country, hey, we got this new document. It's better than the Articles of Confederation. You need to vote for it. Very quick, when everybody sees there's this new option, people kind of fall into two separate camps. You got your Federalists. These are people who support having a federal government. These are the guys that were here and wrote this thing. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. These are just, few of the random ones. There's a lot of them. Everybody that was at the Constitutional Convention would have liked the idea of a federal government because you needed it because it was better than the Articles of Confederation. And they call themselves Federalists. Well, there's a lot of people that come out and like, whoa, hold on now. Not cool. So they're really creative with their name. They call themselves Anti-Federalists because they do not want a federal government. They're like, no. We're just going to stick with the Articles of Confederation. Thank you very much. We're not interested. These people are like George Mason. You may not have heard of him. We haven't talked about him. Patrick Henry, not really in civics, but he's have you ever heard the famous speech, give me liberty or give me death? And then Samuel Adams is actually the cousin of John Adams and viciously fought against the French, the Red Coach leading up to the Revolutionary War in Boston. These guys, George Mason, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams, adamantly against the federal government. They were adamantly against England. And they're like, the last thing we want is a strong federal government. And the Federalists look at them and they're like, guys, can you just give it a rest? They're like, you sound like the Americans of old. And like, what do you mean the Americans of old? They're like, back when everybody was just terrified of a strong central government. Like, we realized after the Articles of Confederation, guys, we got to have a central government. Like, we're going to have some checks and balances in it. It's a really cool, it's such a great idea here with this fantastic central government. And there's checks and the people have all the control. There is nothing here that you could possibly have a problem with. This is the best possible central government that you could have. And the Anti-Federalists look at them and say, oh. So if this is such a great idea, show me where in this Constitution of yours that my individual rights are protected from this great government. Basically, if the government decides not to respect me, what's going to stop them from doing that? What's going to stop this government from coming and telling me what I can or can't print in the newspaper like what happened with John Peter Zenger? Where's that at in your Constitution? when the redcoats showed up at Lexington and Concord and tried to take everybody's guns? Where's that at? They can still do that in this government too. What about the Quartering Act when they were they could force citizens to house troops? This government doesn't stop any of that. Where are all these rights for the people? There's nothing here. You talk all about your legislative branch. Ooh, but where's all the things that guarantee me as a citizen is not going to get abused by this new government? And the Federalist response is, good point. We completely forgot to put any of that in there. So the Anti-Federalists win round one here because everybody realizes they were so focused on checks and balances and federalism and the Great Compromise, New Jersey Plan, Virginia, they forgot basically, hey, let's put in stuff that says the government can't abuse the people. Let's guarantee people individual rights. So that's as far as we're going to get today, because tomorrow everybody has to scamper back real quick and make some changes to this Constitution before anybody will accept it. And that's what we'll pick up tomorrow. But the final question here for today is, what was the strongest argument by the Anti-Federalists not to accept the new Constitution? So answer that completely. And that's as far as we're going to get today. See you guys tomorrow.